State politics now. It has been a week since Governor Cuomo and legislative leaders announced a partial agreement on a property tax cap, but the Assembly has not yet passed this new version presented by Speaker Sheldon Silver, and it's actually not clear whether the Senate Republicans who originally passed the governor's hard 2% cap earlier this year will actually vote in favor of the less strict version, which also includes a sunset provision. So, while we wait to see whether the so-called deal holds up, tax cap opponents are seizing the opportunity to restate their case. They continue to insist that a cap, even with the exemptions carved out in the Assembly bill, will cripple local governments and school districts. They are lobbying instead for a circuit breaker. Joining me now to talk about this is New Yorkers for Fiscal Fairness Executive Director Ron Deutsch. Ron, it's good to see you again.
Nice to be back, Liz.
So you've got this narrow-ish window, and you are hoping, what exactly? That the deal falls apart completely and everybody on your side wins?
Wouldn't that be nice?
Wouldn't it?
But unlikely. But, you know, it seems to me that the legislative leaders, the governor, Senator Skelos, Speaker Silver, have come to a tentative agreement on a tax cap.
Right.
Not that we like that tentative agreement or support it, but what we're trying to say is, you know, you've articulated what the problem is, that people are being taxed out of their homes in New York State, but your solution will not fix that problem, number one. And number two, we need to have a broader discussion about property taxes in general, who carries that burden, and how do we alleviate that burden. And I don't believe a tax cap does that either.
Well, part of the reason why we have you here, of course, is to provide the other side. Last week we talked to some business types who were pretty happy with the tax cap deal, and also to E.J. McMahon, who says he's pretty happy with it too. Now, I'm just curious, the actual deal, and we keep calling it that even though we're not exactly certain when and if it's going to come to fruition, is not exactly what the governor proposed. He wanted a hard 2% cap, and now we're seeing a maybe sunset, at least linking this to rent control and subsequently some exemptions. Can you live with any of that?
Certainly the sunset provision, I think, is wise on the part of the Speaker to put that in the bill. You've seen in states like Colorado where voters, at one point supported a property tax cap, and then after a while, after it was put into place for some time and services were decimated in that state, voters then rejected it through initiative and referendum. So the reality is that this is an experiment, and a bad experiment at that, so there should be a sunset provision in this to make sure that, you know, we need a reality check at some point.
Do you want a sunset provision date certain? Because it seems like there's some wiggle room on that. Initially, it was these two things will exist as long in conjunction. In other words, as long as we've got rent laws, which pretty much is in perpetuity because the Assembly Democrats from downstate are never going to let that go, we will also have a tax cap. I mean, that's not really a sunset date. Then we heard the Speaker say, well, yes, actually, there will be an actual specific date, which seems to indicate that the bill that we've seen from the Assembly is not the final version.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of negotiations going on. I think there are other things that Senator Skelos may not like, that Assembly Speaker Silver may not like in terms of what the governor's proposed relative to what the Speaker's proposed. So now it's really going to be a time when groups like mine and other property tax reform groups across the state have a chance to weigh in again while this issue is again front and center to say, you know, there are better solutions to this problem, and the tax cap is not that solution.
Okay, so you're getting together tomorrow to have this event. The organizations that are on this list, and, you know, I'm looking at the Alliance for Quality Education, for example, Balcony, TaxNightmare.org, New York Property Tax Reform Coalition, Fiscal Policy Institute. These are, generally speaking, left of center. This is labor coalitions. These are progressive, quote-unquote, types. I mean, you know, it seems to be a conservative versus progressive or conservative versus liberal argument. Do you agree with that characterization?
I think to a certain degree that's correct. I think there are certain property tax reform groups out there that, you know, have been rather conservative in their approach. But, you know, whether you're a conservative, a Republican, a Democrat, or a liberal, I think everybody wants the same thing, and that's property tax relief for people who desperately need it. And that's where the circuit breaker comes in, because only when you tie property tax, the property tax burden to someone's individual income level, that's when you address the the problem, because so many New Yorkers, hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, are paying double-digit percentages of their income in property taxes, and that's what needs to be addressed. And a cap is not going to do that, Liz.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have had this conversation before, during, and now after the supposed agreement has actually been hashed out. You know, you have a senator like John Bonasek from the Hudson Valley, who's actually a Republican, who's still out there pushing the millionaire's tax, now also revived by the Assembly Democrats, saying we could use the proceeds to actually provide some tax relief and not only to provide the slowing of growth of property tax increases, right? Your bill's actually going to still increase. It's just going to increase by 2 or maybe as much as 3% a year under this provision, depending on what kind of pension exemptions kick in. And then, of course, if there's an override vote, I mean, you could blow that cap right out of the water. Here's the problem, though. I mean, the governor is just dead set against the millionaire's tax. He's not really into it still, even though he stuck to his budget promise of no new taxes. How are you going to convince him otherwise?
Well, I'm hoping that the people will convince him, right? The governor's been on his People's First tour for quite some time now, saying that, you know, we need to do the will of the people, and Albany legislators need to listen to the will of the people. Well, I think they are listening to the will of the people when it comes to the millionaire's tax. At least Assembly Speaker Silver is, Senator Bonasek is, and many members of the Assembly are. But I think the reality is the governor is not listening to the will of the people. The people want this millionaire's tax. And then again, if you link that to providing property tax relief, I think that's a win-win for everybody.
Ron, is it actually not possible to revisit this issue? I mean, part of the millionaire's tax refloating, if you will, by the Assembly Democrats is actually to set the stage for an argument that's going to probably occur next year. We're looking ahead to an election year budget, and that would be for the entire state legislature. All 212 seats will be up next year. And of course, this is not going to be a year that lawmakers are going to be interested in cutting to the bone the way that they were perhaps more willing to go along with a pretty popular newly elected governor who knows what next year will bring. I mean, do you envision that you're really setting the stage for next year, too? Is that what this is about?
I think we're working in the here and now, Liz. I think we need to get a circuit breaker because so many people out there right now are suffering. They can't afford their property taxes now. And if I can't afford my property taxes now, what good is a 2%, 3%, or even a 6 or 7% increase in my property taxes? How is that going to help me in any way, shape, or form? It's not. So the reality is, and one of the misconceptions that's out there, Liz, is that just because we have a 2% property tax cap means that the individual's taxes won't go up more than 2%. That's simply not true. The tax cap is a levy cap. So it's a cap on the amount that the school district or municipality can levy in that particular district, when in reality we know that regardless of what the levy is, individual taxes can go up substantially more than that because of unequal assessments, because of equalization rates, and a variety of different variables that are not being addressed in this discussion.
Just in parting, Ron, these two things have to exist independently of each other. You can have a cap and a circuit breaker, or could you?
You could absolutely have a cap and a circuit breaker. Our preference would obviously be the circuit breaker, as I've said over and over again. But the reality is you can have both. The only problem is that what a cap is going to do is really harm services at the local level. Because remember, we're putting a cap, the governor wants to put a cap on top of massive cuts in state aid to not just to localities, but to school districts as well. So you're really doing, adding insult to injury at this point.
Well, unless they come up with mandate relief, which is a whole different kettle of fish, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we will, obviously, until this passes, will be, or doesn't, but it looks like all signs are pointing in the direction that something at some point is going to pass that looks like a cap. We'll be keeping people up to date on that. In the meantime, Ron Deutsch, thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Liz.